Right now, we're pleased that all the way from Austria, our next speaker comes, Helmut Schweiger, is a Senior Academy scientist at the Austrian Archaeological Institute of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. After studying classical archaeology and ancient studies, he previously worked at the Institute for Classical Archaeology at the University of Vienna and at the Institute for the Cultural History of Antiquity. In addition to excavations in Austria, Italy, and Egypt, his work focuses on Turkey, such as in Antioch of Pisidia, but especially Ephesus, where he has been responsible for the research project Ephesus in Residential District has been excavated and the uncovering of an imperial late antique square complex in the center of the city has continued. In addition to his role as coordinator of the excavations in Ephesus, he's also responsible for managing the Digital Archaeology and Classic Group. So we're delighted that he is here this afternoon and will lecture on living in the ruins of the future, Ephesus in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. So Dr. Schwaiger.
Hi. Good. So then let's start. First, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to report on the latest research results from late antique and Byzantine Ephesus, and I wish you happy discoveries. In the lecture which follows, in the sense of David Mattingly, an urban biography of Ephesus, which allows a particular phase of urbanism to be understood in a longer timeline of changing urban form, function, and mentalities, should be sketched, and the phenomenon of the city of Ephesus in the Byzantine period based on geographical, topographical criteria and economic functions, yet also a model of social and ideological interactions should be considered. In the field of classical archaeology, Ephesus is regarded as a paradigm for the manifestation of Roman provincial culture in the Greek East. Planned on the drawing board and newly founded in about 300 BC, Ephesus displays the characteristic elements of a Greek city whose appearance nevertheless fundamentally altered in the Roman imperial period. Basically, this is a phenomenon which is encountered in many cities of the Greek East. In the case of Ephesus, furthermore, the natural preconditions necessitated incisive topographical changes. On the one hand, after the late 1st century AD, it was possible to develop the floodplain, therefore allowing a complete expansion of Roman prestigious architecture without regard for pre-existing structures, while on the other hand, due to the advanced sedimentation process, the harbor needed to be fortified and architectonically defined. And a canal created as a connecting route between the harbor bay and the open sea. The Hellenistic city wall lost its function as a fortification. The harbor and the large area of settlement in its immediate vicinity remained unfortified. Suburbs grew up to the north and to the east, here and here. And with the removal of its doors, one of the city gates became unobstructed, yet it's still defined as before the boundary between the living and the dead. The countryside settlements of Ephesus are indeed largely unexplored, although numerous villages are attested by means of epigraphic evidence. With the adoption of Roman traditions, villas and scattered farms During the Roman imperial period, the Artemision experienced its heyday, having developed into a significant commercial factor. Ultimately, the material culture of the city is a reflection of its political, administrative, economical, social, and cultural and religious importance. Research interest in the Byzantine history and archaeology of this Asia Minor city has intensified in recent years. Urban transformation processes during late antiquity, processes which are also attested at Ephesus, are sufficiently understood and generally accepted. Thus, public plazas and open spaces were not abandoned even into the 6th century, yet they did increasingly diminish in importance. In contrast, the space of the street was valorized as a public space, a phenomenon which is ultimately reflected in the sculptural and epigraphic representations. In spite of all of this, however, no significant alterations in the civic picture are evident for the plaza street framework for the manner of public representation. An adherence to imperial traditions is evident. For example, in private domestic architecture, where in late antiquity, newly constructed buildings conformed to the type of the peristyle house. Between 2011 and 2018, an area of the lower city of Ephesus, a section of a city quarter, was excavated. This had been erected in the late 4th, early 5th century, and the last traces of activity here extend up to the 14th century. Based on the result of a geophysical survey, an approximately 2,000 square meter area could be defined within which excavations should take place. If, based on the findings brought to light in the first years of excavation, and also those which were already found in the late 19th century in the neighboring Harbour Gymnasium, one had first assumed that this complex represented a unified, large-scale city palace of prestigious character. This interpretation must nevertheless be revised. As the bordering surfaces which were measured reveal, this is only a section of a large layout city region which was constructed in the area of the Imperial Harbour Gymnasium and the Xystoi, a large square adjacent to the east, not far from the Church of St. Mary and the so-called Byzantine Palace. The fact that we are dealing here with an initiative by a superior authority is shown by the transformation of formerly public space into privately used space at enormous scale. In fact, there are 3 houses which are independent from each other, in part revealing considerable differences in size. Originally, these were erected in the late 4th, early 5th century, as mentioned, in one construction process, and they display massive destructions primarily in the second half of the 7th century. From the typology of their ground plans, the westernmost house and the one in the middle conform to the tradition of imperial peristyle houses, whereas in contrast, the easternmost house has a court without columns. These courtyards serve as spaces of communication and also functioned as dividers. Around them were grouped, according to the possibilities of the existing building space, rooms of differing function and equipment. The courtyards were accessed by entrance rooms, which are located to the north, accessible by a portico, which flanks the road that runs here from the west of the harbour. In all 3 of the houses, regions can be identified which, due to their floor and wall decoration, as well as in part due to the preserved archaeological evidence, were clearly of prestigious representative character. In contrast, rooms can be recognized within the houses which, due to the installations preserved within them, served for activities associated with the household economy. This is also confirmed by the inventory excavated there. This can be clearly recognized in the last phase of House 1. A narrow entrance corridor leads to the interior of the house, the large courtyard. From here, one arrives equally at the commercial rooms in the east, as well as at a row of rooms of prestigious nature. In the commercial room, along the entire southern long wall, a work surface was built in, parallel to which a shaft runs through the entire room, which may well have served as a storage space, a find which is also encountered in other rooms of this quarter. Furthermore, specific archaeological evidence was excavated in this room, which was equally used for stock keeping. A sequence of 3 rooms can be comprehended in the southwest. They display polychrome mosaic floors with a variety of geometric patterns. A sword found there and the point of the scabbard belonging to it, as well as the point of a lance, all hung on the wall as a collection of regalia, make it likely that this space was the audience room for the master of the house. Slightly to the east of this is found a room with an opus sectile pavement, which in the south presents an apsidal arrangement elevated by a step. The walls are decorated with wall paintings, only partially preserved, carried out in imitation of marble incrustation. In the north are 2 closable cupboards. Their contents consisted primarily of bronze objects and glass vessels. Remains of carbonized decorative elements of furniture have also been preserved in the destruction horizon. This room may have served either as a reception room or as a dining room. The remains from the upper story, which are preserved in the findings from the destruction period, also point to prestigiously arranged rooms, due to their decoration with marble incrustation and opus sectile pavements. This house is therefore best to be understood as the residence of a family of the uppermost social class of late antique Ephesus. Besides the entrance corridor in the north, additional rooms are located, however, which are clearly to be interpreted as taberne. They share the characteristic location in the architectonic conglomeration. In addition, other finds such as installations and archaeological material can be mentioned in order to be able to reconstruct small facilities which served commercial purposes. These are clearly separated from the interior of the house from the actual living space. There is no connection by means of passageways or similar features. Additional rooms where commercial activities similarly took place can also be identified. In one room, a number of installations were found, which suggests that agricultural products were processed and foodstuff were prepared here. Finds from the destruction layer, such as marble plaques, with channels secondarily worked in, large burned layers, which are nonetheless clearly delimited, suggesting a considerable amount of burned organic material, and a shaft with specific beam holes indicate a press facility which served the production of liquids. In addition, a domed oven and a walled hearth where foodstuff could be prepared were also found in this room. In the northwest corner were found the remains of an embedded pithos, which had been repaired with lead wire. To the south, an ensemble of rooms was accessed via a doorway, and these were used for storage. Along the walls are still found the remains of built-in benches and work surfaces, as well as cuttings in the massive marble plaque floor, which probably held the supports for a shelving system. Grooves cut later into this floor may well have served for slip resistance and equally suggest that liquid materials were worked with here. Originally, the eastern part of this area was also accessible, and here an open shaft was let into the floor, which is connected to a drain so that the wastewater originated here could be drained off to the north of the street. From this room, there was a connection to the courtyard. Another room of the northern front is noteworthy due to the large number of amphorae. Furthermore, a great quantity of large-scale utilitarian pottery could be excavated from the destruction layer. From this area, a polygonal amphora stopper and was discovered with negative impressions, which could have come on the one hand from coins or on the other hand from lead seals. One token displays the motif of the adoration of Christ child by the Magi. Neither of the objects were produced in Ephesus, but instead they were imported. Due to the finds from this room, one may also assume that it was used as a taberna, even if this space does display a direct connection to the interior of the house. In the area northwestern rooms of the complex, a number of finds from the destruction layer could be associated with the upper story. These are worthy of emphasis due above all to the high concentration of animal bones. Nearly 2,000 bone fragments were analyzed. Amongst these, almost half are associated with pigs, whereby small ruminants are also equally frequently represented with 43%. Particularly noteworthy is that the distribution of the skeletal elements, of which the main share consists of teeth. The majority of the domestic and wild pig's teeth consist of 89% of canine teeth from the upper and the lower jaw. The employment of the same technique in breaking off and removing the upper and lower teeth is conspicuous, and they also display a uniform handling. Based on this material, we can assume that the business for the processing of bones and teeth existed here. On the one hand, bone objects could have been produced, while on the other hand, the teeth could have been ground up for medical purposes. All of the rooms so far described in the ground floor have in common that they were used for commercial purposes and that they lie at the front of the building. For those which were shut off from the actual living areas, an interpretation as taberna seems clear from the building evidence. In what form the taberna were actually used cannot be more precisely determined. The enormous amount of coins, more than 2,000 found there, due to the absence of an association with specific find materials that were traded, allows a broad range of activities to appear possible. To what extent the room in which agricultural products were produced equally represents a taberna as such can also not be precisely answered. In this case, the connection to the interior of the house seems noteworthy, suggesting a direct interaction between the inhabitants and the employees. It is also conceivable that here goods were processed which were closely connected with the function or situation of the master of the house. And this was not in the context of the practice of a small business, as would be common for a taberna. But let's draw now our attention to the harbor of Ephesus. The long oval form which constituted the basis for the hexagonal reconstruction is still visible in the landscape today. Geophysical survey in the southern area of the harbor resulted in the evidence that between the inner edge of the quay wall and the shops or warehouses bordering to the south, a distance of about 25 meters can be inserted, which was probably taken up by a road flanking the harbor basin or stockyards. Based on the data currently available, dense irregular development of differing chronological periods extended around the entire basin. This development was not oriented to the street grid, but much more to the contours of the harbor basin, as well as the course of the streets which followed topographical conditions. A channel connecting the harbor basin with the river Kaistros and the sea or outer harbors is first mentioned in inscriptions at around 200 AD. But recent paleogeographic research indicates that this was a much older development. It is now confirmed by pottery finds that the short channel already existed in Hellenistic period and continually lengthened to the west and finally discharged into an arm of the Kaistros River. Based on geoarchaeological data, the channel was much broader than previously assumed. With 100 meter in average at the mouth of the basin, 120 meter width, the channel was quite broad and comparable to one in Ostia, but became narrowed in the course of its history. On both sides of the canal, a street of tombs developed and was in use until late antiquity. The location of the necropolis, furthermore, is impressive, in that the phenomenon of the street of tombs was displaced to the vicinity of a water channel. But let's return to the Roman harbor basin. The continuous and increased silting up of the harbor basin, as well as the contamination caused by the city itself, resulted in the fact that the harbor required permanent maintenance, and cleaning in order to guarantee its continued usability and unrestricted access for ships. The recurrent problems had been known since the early imperial period, while the serious consequences of an accumulation of silt could be averted up until the late 2nd century by means of enormous physical effort and with the use of technical aids. Dredging is not only attested in various inscriptions, but also, unfortunately, in our drill cores from the harbor basin. Let's take a look at one of our cores, which shows nearly more age inversions than regular dates in the time-depth model. As the inversion shows no consistency with the origin of the dated material, reservoir effects can be excluded at the cores. However, we are aware of the fact that the harbor basin as well as the harbor canal had to be dredged in order to maintain their function. We may have here the result of this activity. Also, irregularities in the sediment sorting point into the same direction. Geochemical analysis were applied in order to trace organic indicators of anthropogenic activities. After a solvent extraction from the sediments, organic compounds are analyzed. The non-target screening allows for the identification of a wide range of organic compounds of biogenic and anthropogenic origin, including a large amount of fecal matter. Heavy mineral analysis had been inspired by this text incised onto a marble stele once erected near the Ephesian Harbour Basin and excavated in the 1950s. The inscription is a decree from Lucius Antonius Albus, proconsul Asia under the reign of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, in which the discharging of rock flour and emery abrasive into the harbor basin has been forbidden, since these materials, byproducts of stoneworking, were thought to have led to an increased accumulation of silt. The overall heavy mineral composition basically corresponds with the components expected for the Kaistros River basin. This is why they are all grayed out in this diagram, with a remarkable exception. Nearly all the samples of the harbor basin cores contain corundum, the main mineral component of emery, whereas the drill cores from the Lake of Bellevue do not contain any corundum at all. So the proconsul's interdiction was obviously based on an actual habit in Roman Ephesus. It is indeed very rare that epigraphic, historical, and scientific evidence match so clearly. A brief glimpse into a monumental building erected at precisely this moment in time allows us to surmise what working steps were necessary for the completion of marble architecture on site. The blocks were delivered in only roughly worked fashion. The accomplishment of the decorative elements, the surface working, and the polishing first took place at the building site, and the waste materials from this processing had to be disposed of. The harbor suffered from this contamination, and even when naturally the delta progression and the unregulated, strongly meandering river Kaistros represented the essential reason for the siltation of the harbor and the canal, the city itself also nonetheless contributed to this decline. I may highlight another one of these results, this time from Palinology. Pollen profiles are a crucial tool for the reconstruction of vegetation composition and vegetation changes through time. However, sometimes they show rather unusual signals. In one core from the mouth of the harbor canal, we see a strong signal of Sacropoterium pollen type corresponding with the period of the harbor use, roughly from the 3rd century BC till the 8th century AD. The corresponding plant, Sacropoterium spinosum, thorny burnet, is widespread in the region in pastured areas, as this spiny shrub can even resist grazing pressure by goats. But how would such a large amount of this shrub be found directly next to the harbor in an urban area? We suggest an explanation inspired the work of colleagues from Israel. They demonstrated that thorny burnet has been used as dunnage, stabilizing transport goods in a Roman shipwreck discovered off the Israeli Carmel coast. Dunnage definitely was required for a wide variety of cargo, also in Roman and late antiquity. And loading as well as unloading cargo as a frequent and daily process in the Ephesian Harbour would definitely leave significant pollen traces if Sacropoterium was used. In addition to the Roman harbour, outer harbours were created in order that larger ships unable to navigate the channel could anchor. One of these outer anchorage places were probably located to the southwest of the Geochemical, 4 kilometers to the west of Ephesus. Maps from the early 20th century indicate that this region the remains of a lake, which was connected via a narrow channel to an arm of the Kaistros. Paleogeographic analyses have again revealed the originally naturally open bay was gradually sealed off towards the Kaistros by means of sandy alluvial deposits. Supplementary to these alluvial regions to the north as well to the south of the Kaistros were geophysically investigated, and to our surprise, dense development of the imperial and late antique periods was confirmed. The heaped up existence of tubuli in an enclosed area to the north of the river arm should indicate a bathing establishment, whereas the structures further to the south could be understood as warehouses based on a preliminary interpretation. The establishments must have been in operation for a long time, as Middle Byzantine pottery attests. We have an impressive, unique harbor landscape in front of us, one which grew over centuries and consists of a large harbor basin of the Roman imperial period, a long, partly artificial and partly natural channel, as well as at least 3 archaeologically confirmed outer harbors. The modern appearance of the Ephesian harbor landscape is the product of a development that took many centuries. Ephesus did not shy away from any efforts and probably nor from any costs in order to keep the direct access to the sea open and, as a result, remain competitive as a harbor city and in consequence as a trading center as long as possible and as long as required. But why did the Ephesians put so many efforts in keeping the harbor alive, even at the time when the urban population was already significantly reduced and the relocation would probably have been more efficient? I think there was, among other considerations, one reason decisive, and this is the importance of the Christian pilgrimage sites located in the old city. That's how Ephesus was called from Byzantine periods. In addition, Ephesus had not lost its function as a cultural and spiritual center. Rather, starting from the numerous sites of Christian memorial, a substantial pilgrimage industry had grown up, which was in no way inferior to the economic role played by the Artemision before. With the localization of the legend of the 7 sleepers in a rock crevice on the eastern spur of the Palinology, the northern city hill of Ephesus, as well as the tomb of St. John on the Hagia Souk, the foundations for the establishment of Ephesus as a Christian pilgrimage destination were laid. Pilgrimage was also most likely a significant factor in preserving the infrastructure of the city of Ephesus during the Middle Byzantine period and in maintaining the streets leading from the harbor to the sacred sites. Great efforts were expended to ensure that the streets in Ephesus remained free of rubble. Specifically, barriers against debris were erected in order to hinder material from sliding down the hill slopes of abandoned quarters. Particularly impressive examples of these drywalls are found along the Kuret streets. Instrumental in these elaborate maintenance measures will have been the necessity for ease of access to the pilgrimage sites of the tomb of St. Luke, the 7 Sleepers Cemetery, the Church of St. Mary, and the Basilica of St. John, as well as the need for the unhindered conduct of processions to the Cave of St. Paul, for example. The pilgrims, who occasionally undertook long journeys to the holy sites in Rome, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Jerusalem, were also purveyors of information and a connecting link between West and East. The economic factor associated with pilgrimage was enormous, since the visitors required accommodation and provisions at the site. Furthermore, endowments and donations were also made to the cult centers. The establishment of Ephesus as a pilgrimage center resulted in an economic revival for the region and provided the motivation for increased efforts in creating a functioning network of roads and connection to the sea in order to guarantee access to Ephesus. In the city and in the extra-urban sanctuaries, establishments were set up which were aimed at pilgrims and which assured their provision and accommodation. In the following reflection, I will focus on only two sites, the Basilica of St. John and the Seven Sleepers. The most significant saint in relation to the city was without doubt St. John the Theologian, who died a natural death at Ephesus in the early 2nd century. In the context of my lecture today, I do not intend to delve deeper into the confusion regarding the identification of this figure, confusion already attested to in late antiquity. Instead, I would far rather concentrate on the archaeological evidence. In Ephesus, St. John was worshipped on the fortified hill of Selçuk, the medieval Hagia Souk, which is a corruption of the name Hagios Theologos. It is believed that the church which was built there was erected over his grave, as we heard today already. And a Syrian source informs us that the saint, after his missionary activities in the city, settled on a hill near the temple of Artemis, and from this vantage point observed the destruction of the temple. This topographical description fits perfectly with the Hagia Souk, which is located in the immediate vicinity of the Artemision. St. John apparently died here at high age and was buried there. During excavations at the Hagia Souk, it has been possible to identify three main phases within the church complex. The first phase outlines a square building, which has been interpreted as a memoria for St. John. No secure information exists regarding the date of its construction, but following an inscription, then the construction of the memoria might date back to the period of Constantine the Great. This, however, is not at all certain. In around 400 AD, the pilgrim Egeria made mention of a martyrium sancti et beati apostoli Ioannis. This might, in fact, refer to the cruciform church, which certainly existed by the date of 431, since it is mentioned in the Acts of the Ecumenical Council. A monumental new construction initiated 435-436 under Justinian replaced the older church, and in scale and opulence was not surpassed. For this reason, Procopius referred to it as the most sacred of the Ephesian churches. The tomb of St. John lay in an underground crypt at the intersection of the arms of the cross. This could be accessed by means of a narrow flight of stairs in the rear area of the presbyterium. Here, on holy days, the dust of St. John, the manna, was intercepted from his mortal remains, and according to Gregory of Tours, the healing of sickness was attributed to this manna. The production of small clay bottles sold as Ephesian eulogia were part of this phenomenon. These were small, approximately 4 to 8 centimeters tall objects manufactured from 2 molded halves with relief decoration on both sides. There is no certain evidence indicating what the little bottles once contained. Conceivably, they contained the dust of St. John, which was annually collected, or perhaps also olive oil and wine, which was blessed and bottled during special ceremonies. It was not only the mortal remains of the saint that were preserved in the Basilica of St. John, also other valuable relics were safeguarded there. These included a fragment of the Holy Cross and even the part that had rested against the head of Jesus Christ. These relics were prepared in gold and precious gems, and were worn by St. John during his lifetime around his neck on a golden chain. And furthermore, the church also safeguarded a tunic sewn by the Mother of God for St. John, which he wore while reading Holy Mass. And not least, the treasury of the Basilica also preserved the book composed by the hand of John himself in golden letters, the book of the Apocalypse, also studded with precious gems. For this precise description of the relics, we are grateful to Ramon Muntaner, the chronicler of the Catalonian expedition to Ayasoluk. None of these relics is preserved today. In 1307, they were in fact sold by the Turks for grain as a protective measure against famine. Saint John was nevertheless also omnipresent at the city of Ephesus. This is attested by frescoes of the saint as well as west of the theater, as well as at the Dragonos Agora. And in addition, a number of block monograms which were discovered on the steps of the Church of the Serapeon may also be connected to the saint. They clearly refer to Johannes, but this was one of the most common first names in late antiquity, making a certain interpretation difficult indeed. In this connection, it cannot be completely ruled out that they have to do with the Bishop Johannes, active in the 6th century, who is known from his forced baptism on large scale. The most famous saints of the 3rd century are the 7 sleepers that were put to death in the course of the cruel persecution of the Christians under the Emperor Decius. According to the legend, 7 young men in the vicinity of the emperor were persecuted to their refusal to sacrifice to the gods. They retreated to a mountain cave and died there of starvation. In the early 5th century, during the reign of the Emperor Theodosius II, the cave was opened by workmen who cleared the stones, and the young men were reawakened to new life. But after attesting to the resurrection, they passed away again. The emperor had built a church above their graves, and the site became one of the most important centers of pilgrimage of early Christianity and the Middle Ages in Ephesus. The cave of the 7 sleepers consisted of a burial complex dating to the 3rd century AD, and based on the evidence of the closure slabs from the graves, it was already frequented by Christians at this early date. These inscriptions are the oldest pieces of evidence for Christianity in Ephesus. They attest to the existence of Christian community in the period of persecution and the burial of its members in the cemeterium on the Panayota. Under Theodosius II, the cult of the 7 sleepers was established here, and the burial complex was covered by a church. The memory of the period of persecution and the burial of those persecuted must have remained a vivid recollection, so that inhabitants continued to remember it even 200 years later. Without a doubt, the tomb chambers where the burial locations of the 7 youths was localized can be viewed as central sites of cult veneration. There are some indications that the cult was set up as a direct religious political measure in response to heretical currents which cast doubt on the resurrection. The legend of the 7 sleepers as an attestation for resurrection after death and the establishment of the legend is an impressive example for the exploitation of narratives of saints in religious political controversies. In the following centuries, the complex was expanded through the addition of churches and chapels, as well as a couple of 100 burials. Wall paintings, stucco decoration, and colorful mosaics floors suggest wealthy patrons who sought their salvation here. In 430 AD, the site was first described in a Latin pilgrimage report as a site worth seeing, but vigorous pilgrimage activity had already developed around the cult. The most recent graffiti by pilgrims date to the year 1498 and therefore extend beyond the end of the period of the Byzantine Empire. But let us look more closely again to the 2 archaeologically known graves of saints, that is the grave of John and the grave of the 7 sleepers. In both cases, we are dealing with accessible crypt-like complexes, and in both cases as well, we can assume that the most holy elements, that is, the relics, could be seen through a window or other opening. For the crypt of the 7 sleepers, it is very probable that the visitors were guided through the burial site crawling on their knees. Without doubt, similar sites will have existed for other Ephesian martyrs, where direct contact to the saint was possible. But what form did the veneration of relics take, however, at the other Ephesian churches, which had no explicit pilgrimage function? Principally, one would assume, following early Christian tradition, that relics of founders were placed under the altar, carefully deposited in a reliquary pit. Nevertheless, there is no secure evidence for this in the archaeological record. Are we therefore allowed to assume that at Ephesus there was another tradition regarding dealing with relics? Perhaps a tradition in which the visual and haptic experience of the saint was more immediately important. Recent investigations in a church site in Pamučak, 6 kilometers away from Ephesus, as well as a precise interpretation of a marble reliquary, probably provide the key to the puzzle. The sanctuary, accessed by the harbor and consisting of a church on the summit, a crypt lying at the lower level, an architectonically designed route connecting the individual elements and annex buildings skillfully took advantage to the natural conditions and extended over 2 levels. The church is 3-aisled with a semicircular apse in the east and a narrow narthex placed in front of the main hall in the west. A narrow stairway also led from here down to the crypt. 2 marble columns spanned by an arch frame the elaborately designed entrance and lead to a vaulted passageway which constituted a roofed connection between the crypt and anchoring point at the harbor. The ingenious engineering of the natural conditions in the architecture, its elaborate construction and high quality features, as well as the uniform construction process imply that the planning and execution were carefully conceived and that a financially generous sponsor can be assumed behind the building program. With the exception of the mosaic pavement, which based on its motifs can be roughly dated to the 5th century, there are only a few indications for the date of the complex. Possibly the most significant find is a 2-part reliquary made most probably out of Proconnessian marble in the form of a sarcophagus. The technical observations on the Ephesian reliquary itself imply that the division of the compartments was secondarily executed and the centrally located libation hole in the original planning related to the entire chest. The small chest was therefore adapted for a specific ritual. In favor of this conclusion are additional details of its construction, such as the hinge mechanism, the lock of the chest, and the lack of a possibility of drainage. A hinge contraption only makes sense if the chest was always being opened and closed. The libation hole and the subdivision of the compartments, which exactly take this into account, indicate that the liquid, probably oil, as it penetrated, poured over the primary relic contained in the larger compartment, then flowed over the dividing wall into the smaller compartment where it was caught, and from there it could again be removed as contact relic. The ritual practiced in the church in Pamučak therefore provided for the public presentation of primary relics. This hypothesis finds support in the literary sources of the 6th century, which in the Eastern Mediterranean region attest to the display of holy bones when opened. The relics were, however, not only viewed, but also sacred oil was also obtained via contact with them. Oil, which in the form of impregnated cloths could be given to the pilgrims. The reconstruction of the site allows the conclusion that pilgrims were guided into the small harbor bay. Here, the procession into the crypt and the church began. It is nonetheless also conceivable that priests came directly to the coast with the reliquary in order to provide the pilgrims with eulogia, for example, in clothes soaked in holy oil. Unfortunately, we do not know the name of the individual honored here and can therefore only speculate that it might have been a patron saint of seafarers and travelers. Just as in Antiquity, Aphrodite Pontia watched over the Bay of Ephesus, so might a Christian saint have taken over this function. And thank you for your attention.